What is the greatest, F it, I'll do it myself, in history? In 1888, Almon Brown Stroger, an undertaker, noticed he was losing a lot of business to the other undertaker in town. He found out that the other undertaker's wife was a telephone operator, and when she intercepted people asking to be connected to Stroger's funeral home, the operator would route the call to her husband's funeral home instead. 3 years later, Stroger patented the automatic teller exchange, a system which allowed telephone users to make calls without the need for human operators, single-handedly destroying an entire workforce. This is very personal for me, but my grandpa, who raised me with my grandma, retired as an engineer, was bored, and saw a need for what back then was called mobility equipment. He invented the standing frame in the 1980s. It allowed people with spinal issues, for example quadriplegia, to be transitioned from lying down to vertically standing up, fully supported and safe, without them leaving their bed. He made quite a few variations for different sizes and ages, and they sold all over the world. He simply said, no one else was helping, so I did. All from our suburban garage in Sydney, Australia. He was awarded an Order of Australia, one of our country's highest honors. He was my hero. Barry Marshall. He thought the ulcers were caused by bacteria, but couldn't get ethics approval for human testing. So, he drank H. pylori bacteria himself, and developed ulcers 3 days later, which confirmed his theory. He won the Nobel Prize for that. He won the Nobel Prize for drinking the bacteria, and then killing them with antibiotics, resolving the ulcers, demonstrating control. When a bunch of people called him a loony bin for years. They were not entirely wrong. Definitely a cavalier perspective on science, medicine, evidence, and ethics. Nowadays, if scientists try to experiment on themselves, they are rarely able to publish it. Sample size for one. No approval from an internal review board, regarding the ethics of the experiment, for another. Girolamo Cardano was a mathematician in the Renaissance, who was trying to find a generalized solution for the roots of cubic functions. One of the problems that kept popping up was, he needed to take the square root of negative numbers, something traditional real number algebra wouldn't allow. Cardano, instead of writing it off as impossible, simply decided that these imaginary numbers, as they were called later, must exist, an astoundingly controversial opinion at the time. Now, we use them every day. Maybe not the greatest, but George Lucas wanted to make a Flash Gordon movie. They wouldn't give him the rights, so he wrote his own space opera, created his own special effects company, and basically became a multi-billionaire by making the biggest money-making movie franchise there ever was. At least, for a while. I've seen similar stories with video games. Donkey Kong was originally a Popeye game, before the license fell through. And Doom was going to be based on Alien. There's a reality out there, where Popeye becomes the face of gaming. You know that old wives' tale, about how cracking your knuckles will cause arthritis? Well, Dr. Donald Unger decided to test that theory in the most extreme way he could. Once a day, for 50 years, he cracked the knuckles in his left hand, but not in his right hand. Neither hand developed arthritis, thus disproving the old wives' tale. 50 effing years, people. The dedication is just chef's kiss. In the 90s in the UK, I saw a TV talk show, where one of the guests was a woman, who for her whole adult life, probably 20 years, had used moisturizer on one side of her face and not the other. She was very shy, the interview was brief, and then they read out that a scientist had determined there was no difference to the two sides of her face, and the program moved to the next segment. I remember as a 10-ish-year-old, being weirdly horrified, that 20 years of dedication was reduced to a 2-minute lightweight section, on a low-rate TV show. It's not exactly an F it I'll do it myself, but a professor, called Richard Scoilver, along with his research partner, Georgina Long, had developed breakthrough melanoma research and treatments. Last year, Scoiler was diagnosed with a type of grade 4 brain cancer that was incurable. So, him and his partner developed a new experimental treatment, with Scoiler being the first patient to receive it. A year later, Scoilver appears completely cured, with no sign recurrence of the brain tumor. You wrote his name 4 times in 3 different ways, so I decided to Google the correct spelling. Turns out, his name is spelled Scoiler, which is none of the variations you used. Now, that's an F it, I'll do it myself moment, right there. In the early 60s, Ford was interested in purchasing Ferrari, and poured a lot of money towards investigating their finances, their facilities, etc. Enzo Ferrari played along, but ultimately didn't really plan on actually selling to Ford, instead, using the fact that Ford was interested in order to negotiate a favorable deal, when he eventually sold to Fiat, a deal which allowed him to maintain control over the racing division of Ferrari. To say that Ford was pissed about having the rug pulled out from under them, would be the understatement of the century. They figured out, the only thing they could do that was guaranteed to piss off Enzo, would be to go after his pride and joy, Ferrari's winning streak at Le Mans, and so, they set out to do exactly that. They poured tons of money and resources into making a car that would accomplish exactly that, which ended up being the Ford GT40. Another major Enzo Ferrari blunder was Lamborghini's sports car division. Lamborghini was making tractors, and was pretty successful at that. Ferruccio Lamborghini owned a Ferrari sports car, and had issues with the clutch, and as he had some mechanical experience, he figured out the issue, and reached out to Enzo, with some suggestions on how it could be fixed, only to be met with contempt. Ferruccio was pissed off, and promptly decided he'd build a better sports car than Ferrari ever could, resulting in the Miura, which laid the foundations for Lamborghini to continue making sports cars. Sony going into gaming industry, after failed partnership with Nintendo on CD add-on. The rest is the history of one of the best-selling home video game consoles. PlayStation. Yup. There is even one or two, literally one or two, copies of the Nintendo PlayStation that exist. Nintendo went behind Sony's back, and announced a partnership with Sony's competitor, Philips, to make a few Zelda games for the Philips CDI. Sony immediately cancelled their partnership with Nintendo, the Nintendo/Sony PlayStation halted production, and Sony took the technology to create the PS1. And at the next generation of gaming consoles, the PS2, was insanely popular by being a dual-purpose DVD player, and as Sega was pushed out of the console wars, Sony took its place, while Microsoft was prompted to create the Xbox in turn. Now we have Sony and Xbox, essentially being their own competition in the console wars, while Nintendo serves as a less powerful, but innovative, and family-friendly position. Nintendo does its own thing, while people talk about PlayStation versus Xbox. My vote goes to Dashrat Maji. When his wife died, in 1959, after being injured from falling from a mountain, and due to the same mountain blocking easy access to a nearby hospital in time, he decided to carve a 110-meter long, 360 feet, 9.1 meter wide, 30 feet, and 7.7 meter deep, 25 feet, path, through a ridge of hills, using only a hammer and a chisel. Tony Iommi lost the tips of his ring and middle fingers on his right hand, in a sheet metal accident, at age 17. Told he'd likely never play guitar again, as he was left-handed, and injured his fretboard hand, Tommy fashioned his own homemade thimbles, and learned to play again. Not having full sensation in his fingers, he found it difficult to play, so, he tuned his guitar down to loosen the strings, effectively, creating the heavy metal sound Black Sabbath would eventually become famous for. To add to this, he specifically tuned a whole step and a half down, to C# standard. He also used lighter gauge strings, to further decrease the tension. I have lupus, and it's made my fingers sensitive. Bending strings can be painful. I took up Iommi's idea, and it's made it so much easier to play unrestrained, like I used to. Edit, listen to War Pigs live, and compare it to the studio version. The live version is tuned down, and it's so deep and growly. It sounds like it should have been the original. My vote is Alex Zanardi. Former Formula 1 and kart racer. Back in 2001, he'd returned to kart, and got in an accident that caused another car to shear the nose of his off. If you're unfamiliar with the body plan of this kind of car, that doesn't sound like much, but these are those low, open-wheel vehicles, and the nose has the driver's legs in it. So, he suffered traumatic amputation of both legs, one at and one above his knee, and they had to chop more off, to clean up and close the wounds, lost 3/4 of his blood volume, and woke up after the crash a double amputee. Now, most people would go, wow, I am lucky to be alive after such a crash, I should probably take it easy, and make the most of the rest of my life, and stay the F away from cars after one tore my legs off. But Alex Zanardi is not most people. As soon as he was healed, and fitted with prosthetics, he started trying to drive again, and found all the prosthetics to him to just be insufficient for driving with, and ended up learning about and designing his own prosthetics, to his own standards, to facilitate getting himself back behind the wheel of a car, and on a track again. He was able to get back in a cart to ceremonially finish the race he was nearly killed in 2003, and moved on to racing again in touring series, later in 2003, and has been racing in various ways, up until recently. This includes continuing with hang cycling, which he picked up in 2001, while recovering from the amputations, and even competed in the Paralympics, and winning multiple gold and silver medals, marathons, and setting records in the process. Unfortunately, in 2020, he suffered a second serious racing accident, while hang cycling, during a road race, where he lost control, and went face first, into an oncoming truck. And lived. Again. As of 2022, he's back home, and continuing to recover, and no word on if he'll take his third lease on life, to continue racing, once recovered. Incredible man. On a non-racing note, the man has the weirdest luck, because in the middle of 2022, he got hospitalized again from a house fire, and lived, again. I can't easily find if he was actually injured in the fire. The hospitalization is listed as being because the fire damaged equipment he needs to live, so it may just have been the only place that had the stuff he needed, and he wasn't any further hurt. Something really has it out for him, and something else will not let him die. The Wright brothers. Let go. They actually set out to build a working heavier-than-air flying machine themselves, and never expected anyone else to do it for them. They originally believed they could rely on other people's knowledge and research for multiple things, such as airfoils, propellers, and engines. They soon found out they couldn't. So, they built their own wind tunnel to research airfoils, and later propellers, so they could build wings that could generate lift, and propellers that would effectively propel the aircraft forward. After finding out nobody had ever considered building a lightweight engine, they figured out how to build one themselves. They even developed a warping trailing edge for their wings, to control the roll movement of the aircraft, though similar functionality, now universally known as aileron, had been invented by others before them. Still, they appear to be the first to seriously consider the need for 3-axis control for aircraft. Then they flew their own contraption, which may have been necessary, because it was so complicated to keep in the air. One had to know it pretty intimately to have any kind of hope to keep it flying, even for 12 seconds. And nobody had considered organized training of pilots yet, so, shortly after, the Wright brothers established a flight school, also. Can only remember a moment in personal history. I was the last generation in my country to do mandatory military service. And apparently my generation is particularly lazy. We were supposed to pass some sort of exercise parcours, and had a time that we were supposed to do it in. Almost nobody could do it, and everyone complained that it's some sort of elite target that obviously can't be reached. We were stunned when the officer, chubby guy, in his 50s, flew through that entire thing, with a mixture of rage and disappointment in our performance, easily a minute faster than any of us did. Didn't say a word after that, neither did we. Nobody ever questioned the guy again. If he said, "It's possible," it was possible, after that demonstration. After the death of her husband, Pharaoh Thutmose II, Egypt was supposed to be ruled by her stepson, Thutmose III. However, he was still a child, and Hatshepsut was meant to act as regent, until he came of age. At moment, instead of merely serving as regent, Hatshepsut declared herself pharaoh, one of the very few women to do so, in ancient Egypt. She ruled for over 20 years, expanded Egypt's trade networks, commissioned grand architectural projects, like her famous temple at Deir el-Bahri, and established a period of peace and prosperity. While not world-changing, my wife had cancer, and was going in and out of the hospital for months, because of a life-threatening infection. There were a lot of things that I didn't like about her care. She finally got better, but her doctors said that she was going to be having GI problems, and probably cancers for the rest of her life. I wanted her to have better care than she had gotten up to that point, so I quit being an engineer, went back to school, and became a registered nurse. Then, a few years later, she cheated on me with a guy she worked with, who would post on Facebook about how there were dinosaurs on Noah's Ark. Well, he probably didn't say "F it," but Georges Lemaitre was a Belgian priest and astronomer, who basically came up with what is now known as the Big Bang Theory. He was at the famous, at least for physicists, 1927, Solvay conference, and while he was still fresh off getting his PhD, he managed to get to talk to Einstein about his idea of an expanding universe that started with a singularity. He was this young upstart kid, among some of the greatest minds of the age. Marie Curie, Niels Bohr, Heisenberg, Dirac, and Einstein was dismissive of his notion, saying, "From the point of view of physics, this seems to me abominable." Lemaitre was right, of course, and years later, Einstein had to admit that he was wrong. Leo Major. During the summer of 1944, while he was out on a solo reconnaissance mission, he spotted two German soldiers nearby. Without hesitation, he killed one and captured the other. Then he went after their commanding officer and a whole German garrison, taking down a few more soldiers along the way. Even when under fire from other Germans, he just kept walking and, on his own, managed to capture 93 German soldiers. On his own. In 1945, Leo was hit a landmine while in a truck, breaking his back, ribs, and both ankles. They told him he'd be discharged. Leo didn't care. So, he snuck out of the field hospital, stayed with a Dutch family until he recovered, and then made his way back to his battalion. He volunteered to scout out the city of Zwolle and, once he set off, decided he'd just take the city himself. He convinced a German soldier to deliver a message to the German forces, and then spent the night causing havoc around the city. He fired shots, threw grenades, captured soldiers, and cleared out the SS building. His strategy worked so well, that the Germans thought the entire Canadian army was invading, but it was only effing Leo. By morning, the town was empty of Germans, and the Canadian army strolled right in. It literally took him one night. Fun fact, he also had an eye patch. He lost his eye earlier, because of a grenade. But decided, he could still be a sniper. In 1940, Polish army officer, and Polish resistance soldier, Witold Pilecki, volunteered to be captured by the German occupier, and be placed in Auschwitz concentration camp, in order to infiltrate it. He successfully organized a resistance movement inside, collected a lot of intel on Nazi atrocities, and escaped it, in 1943. In 1944, he fought in the Warsaw Uprising. He didn't accept the Soviet occupation of Poland, and remained loyal to the Polish government in exile, based in London. He returned to Poland after the war, in 1945, to report on the situation there. Sadly, he was arrested in 1947 by Communist Poland's secret police, tortured, and executed in 1948. Maria Oktyabrskaya. After her husband was killed, fighting Nazis in 1941, Oktyabrskaya sold her possessions to donate a tank for the war effort, and requested that she be allowed to drive it. She received, and was trained to drive, and fix a T-34 medium tank, which she named Fighting Girlfriend, Boyovaya Podruga. Oktyabrskaya proved her ability and bravery in battle, and was promoted to the rank of sergeant. After she died of wounds from battle in 1944, she was posthumously made a Hero of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union's highest honor for bravery during combat. She was the first female tank driver to be awarded the title.